Maintenant? Oui. Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable devoted to the topic of mega corporations. Are they more powerful than governments? My name is Nicolas Abouchi. I'm an economic correspondent for the German newspaper FAZ in Paris, and I welcome our four speakers today. Ms. Aurore Laluc, member of Parliament, member of the president of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Commissions at the European Parliament. Welcome. And then to your left, Christian Kelton, who is Master of Law and is the president of the Greenland Business Association. This is the main association representing businesses in Greenland. Welcome. And then next to him we have Pierre Lévy, who has graduated from ESCP and from ENA. He is a French diplomat, he is a current ambassador in the Czech Republic, and for about 5 years he was the ambassador of France in Russia. And he now works at the National Studies Institute and has written a book entitled In the Heart of Russia at War. Welcome, and to his right we have Mr. Luis Muniz, who is a civil engineer by trade, also has an MBA, and he's in charge of the Global Advisory Poll for Latin America at Rothschild & Co. in Sao Paulo. Welcome, and before we get started, as usual, I will give the floor to the coordinator of this roundtable, Mr. Bruno de Creuse, who's a teacher, professor at Aix-Marseille University, and is specialized, among others, on the issues of employment and housing, but other issues as well. Thank you, Bruno, and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Bruno de Creuse. I'm a professor of economy, but also the dean of the Economy and Management faculty, which is here in Aix-Marseille University. If I say it's because if I'm the dean, it means I'm not young. If I'm not young, it means I was a student in the 90s. And guess what? What did we talk about in the 90s? We were talking about multinational firms governing the world. Back then it was a huge topic, and as you see, it hasn't changed. But what has changed today, after all? Two things. Firstly, the size of players. The biggest stock capitalization in the 90s in the US was $100 billion. Currently, the highest stock capitalizations are about $1,000 billion. So in terms of scale, we've completely changed size. And then we also have very different companies in terms of production. In the past, the biggest corporations would produce cigarettes, sodas, detergents, cars, software, but now they're first and foremost digital producers and finance producers as well. They are shareholders of the global economy with a huge influence, and we also have major corporations in cybersecurity and in the aerospace industry. We can see that these corporations have an economic, financial, technological power and geopolitical power as well that is formidable. But according to me, the new thing is not that. The new thing is that these corporations do not simply produce goods and services. They also produce narratives and visions for the future. And that's what's completely crazy. Who talks these days of the superintelligence of AI in general? Who talks of the lengthening of life expectancy? Who talks of the end of labor? All these huge questions. We would like major political leaders to ask these questions, but it is not the case. It's actually the leaders of major corporations in the tech industry that ask these questions. Of course, for us Europeans, it gives us vertigo because it actually puts face to face our states, and it showcases the perceived vulnerability our states who should be able to protect us, but who struggle to produce transformation narratives that could federate us around industrial, technological projects. So this is exactly the heart of the issue for us Europeans. Does it mean that mega corporations are against states? No, I think it depends on our model for our societies, because we have different examples. In the US, of course, mega corporations flourish alongside the American states, not against the North American states. What would they be without the energy policies in the states? What would they be without universities in the states, without public research, without the depth of financial markets in the US? For example, public orders are essential for SpaceX. They wouldn't exist without them. So in the US, we flourish alongside, mega corporations flourish alongside the states. So that leads us to two questions that show the paradigm and will help us structure our debate. Firstly, what are the states, which are the states able to host mega corporations while still keeping a control over our collective destiny? That's the first question. Second question for us Europeans, for us French people, a year before the presidential election, are we still able to produce economic conditions, political conditions, cultural conditions that would make the next mega corporations emerge, but not any mega corporations, the next European mega corporations, the next French mega corporations of tomorrow? So I've asked these questions, and I now leave you with our four panelists. Thank you. Thank you, Bruno. And Christian, let's start with you. You came from Greenland. Lately, it's been a country increasingly perceived as threatened by the politics of a president of a large country rather than by mega corporations. So what scares you most, mega corporations or the policy of a specific president?
And thanks for having us. Yes, coming in on behalf of Greenland, trying to give the Greenland perspective here. And as mentioned, we do have a large neighbor trying to influence Greenland at the moment. Looking at Greenland from the outside, we are always going to be small. The GDP of Greenland is 2.7 billion euro. So any company coming into Greenland, doing anything with Greenland, in or around Greenland, is always going to be the bigger part compared to our government. Looking at the discussion for today, Greenland may be a thing of the past or the answer to the future in terms of the government controlled. As mentioned by Bruno, we've seen in the US that the government buy into more equity, into more companies in the space of the US. We've seen Chinese subsidies, we've seen Chinese government-owned companies. In Greenland, the state, or the Greenlandic home rule, because we are not fully sovereign, own more than 55% of GDP through government-owned and government-controlled companies. So hence, we do have a very, very large control of corporations in Greenland owned 100% by the government. Now, all of these companies are within critical infrastructure, so it's one way for the government to control the critical infrastructure and make sure that the critical infrastructure does not go on foreign hands. This is within tech, telecom, it's basic infrastructure like airports, airlines, and shipping lines. All of these companies own more or less 100% of the markets that they're in. So back to the size. Looking at the larger enterprises in terms of their size, I think it's important to remember that size is not necessarily the same as power. What remains with the government is still the legitimacy, the rule of law, democratic accountability, taxation, security, ownership of the natural resources, and the license to operate. One of the issues we've been seeing in Greenland is that through the ownership of these companies, other politics are also being put into the company. So labor politics, social politics, and other functions that do not lie with the core of the corporations. Now, this could be seen as an issue, but it could also be seen as an opportunity for governments to actually do more politics through the merger or through the work with the larger enterprises. And I'll just finish off the first few minutes here by reminding us that Greenland is a very small country in size of economy, very large in geography, and our underground. We sit on 24% of the rare earth minerals in our underground, but no foreign company or no mining or mineral company owns Greenland. That is with the government of Greenland. So ultimately, governments will still decide where the projects happen.
Thank you, Christian. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Ms. Laluc, we were just told that Greenland is trying to protect its essential infrastructure. What about Europe and critical infrastructure? Europe. I'll start by picking up on what was brilliantly said by both speakers before me. I think there's always a link between the private and the public sector. They will always work alongside. There's nothing new in that. Corporations now are huge players. In the 2000s, I was already researching it. It was already something on our minds. Maybe what's changed now, and maybe what offends us a bit, are two things. Firstly, these corporations that sometimes can constitute an issue, they're not always French and they're not always European. And I think that's where the issue lies. We suffer a lot from these tech giants. We haven't given their names, but that's exactly what we're talking about at the moment, tech giants. We suffer from their measures, their action economically, but also democratically, because we've seen a lot of intrusion in the public debate, generally on social media. And that's where the issue lies. We still haven't managed to create this type of competitor, which are in the end political armed branch, because in the end a large number of North American big tech corporations serve the interests of Donald Trump. So I think politics always comes first, because the politician can do something that a corporation cannot do. The politician can say no, and can say no to the private sector. And sometimes the politician has to say no. The politician is the one deciding where the limits are. It's the legislators as well. That's why tech giants are very violent towards the EU, because this is a sector that always needs expanding. They have not a very intensive business model, but rather extensive. So they always need to be conquering new markets. And we are causing them problems because we have rules, for example, DSA, DMA, and other rules that prevent them from progressing as much as they would want. And that's where we can see the politician comes first. And that's where we have to be very careful when we talk about deregulation and simplification. Beware, this is our strength. This is what protects us. This is what protects the rule of law. And the EU is a normative power, but not enough. I actually think we should have an industrial policy. I would like us to be even more aggressive towards the outside. But it is a normative power, and having a normative power is not nothing, because it gives you the power to say no. It gives you the power to say, in my home, it's my rules. So I think the politician player remains first, even if we have mega corporations. And mega corporations can come and help the politicians, and the politicians can also help mega corporations. That's the case in the US. Trump's entire policy on cryptocurrency, what's the point? Well, the point is to firstly support a part of his economic base, but also helps him enrich himself. I think he's just earned $1 billion with cryptocurrency. So it goes hand in hand. Let's always remember that the politician comes first, because the politician can say no. Yes, indeed, there are mega corporations, but there's also a bubble. And now it's up to us, first and foremost, to create our own tech giants and to protect ourselves from these corporations that actually serve a political agenda. And maybe if Trump wasn't in power, they would have a different agenda. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Levy, you've lived in Russia, in a country where it's absolutely for sure that politics dominate, but it's just one example among many. Yes, indeed, I come from a country where geopolitics is at the heart of everything, with levers, even weapons like Gazprom and a lot of other companies, Rosatom and others. I think it is a big revealer of the state of the world. If I were to describe the global landscape in confrontation, I would say that for about 30 years we've been living in a world that's shaped by certain forces. You know, globalization means interdependency, it means a win-win situation, it means everyone's supposed to be winning with exchanging goods and services and persons, and then you have value chains, and then you also have the power politics, geopolitics, the zero-sum game. Zero-sum games like trying to conquer territories, natural resources, or at the moment the US policy. We've talked of Greenland. It's also the Russian policies at the moment. So we do see that the geopolitics and power policies are taking over at the moment. States are trying to instrumentalize, they're trying to weaponize their large corporations. What's really striking to me, and Bruno de Creuse was very right to recall us that this is a very, this has been the case for a long time. Raymond Vernon, sovereignty at bay when I was a student, and Galbraith, these were the very first topics they broached back then. But what's striking to me now is that we don't talk of multinational firms anymore. We actually assign them a nationality. They are Russian corporations, they are Chinese corporations, North American corporations. So it's extremely, it shows us what's happening on that front. Secondly, they are being used by powers. Let's take the example of Russia. The Russians are trying to trap Trump. The trap is that of the normalization of Russian-American relations. Let's forget about the conflict in the Ukraine. You'll see what will happen. We'll promise tens of billions of contracts. Everything is being negotiated. We don't understand what it corresponds to, but it seems very far from reality. And then you realize that US corporations don't want to go there because they know there's an international landscape that's degraded. They actually find all of this to be hazardous. Same goes with the tariff policies by Trump, which actually cancels the comparative advantage because corporations have value chains that are being damaged by these tariff policies. And yet, I do not think that we're faced with a scale change, but a nature change. The previous speakers have said it in their own ways, but for example, we see that in some key sectors, we have corporations that are much more flexible than states. For example, in the aerospace industry, in the telecom industry, with SpaceX, with Blue Origin, these are corporations that were created about 20 years ago, and look at their results now. It's extraordinary. And secondly, you've mentioned their vision. I would also use a term that's quite trendy, the term of narrative. Those are corporations that develop a narrative. For example, listen to Elon Musk, and it's also, it's quite frightening. And the relation is actually more complex than it seems. First, because there's a race between the regulatory power of states and of the EU and technology. And we have to admit that sometimes we're lagging behind because regulating takes more time than making technical progress. So we are lagging behind. And we also have to manage finding a balance between market elements, sovereign elements, and I also have in mind, like everyone else, the example of Palantir very recently. That's a corporation that's developing, progressing, that's requesting capitals, and then suddenly there's an executive order by the American presidency saying, stop. So basically, us Europeans, I think we have to reintroduce this European perspective. We Europeans are in the middle of a fight which is absolutely decisive for European future, for our companies, for our technology. This is a fight that might seem at first glance like it's imbalanced, because on one side we're in the there's an OECD report showing that the Chinese are being subsidized 3 to 8 times more than European companies, and of course on the other side we have Trump's policies and his mega corporations. Thank you, Mr. Levy. Mr. Muniz, so you come from Sao Paulo, from South America. Is this a European debate, or are you having the same debate on your own territories?
It's a historical and a long time debate.
Plus près. Microphone closer.
Okay, better now. Okay. Going back to the title of the discussion today, are big corporations stronger than states? Let's touch that subject with another question. Has any corporation become bigger without being close to the state over time? I don't remember any. Second question, is it a problem? Then we have two possible answers. Some people think, and major mergers, transformational deals happen worldwide because large companies have better costs, they gain economies of scale. In my part of the world, they upgrade the zip code and therefore lower funding costs. So there are benefits of companies being mega companies and large companies. On the other hand, there are professors, credible academics like Professor Luigi Zingales, that say that this could be a problem, and he has written crony capitalism and saving capitalism from the capitalists, and even has a podcast called Capitalism, where he criticizes the power that the big companies have achieved. So how do we do that? How do we mitigate these issues? We should have stronger regulatory agencies, stronger central banks that regulate bank developments. We just had a problem in my country with a huge banking scandal. We should have better regulatory agencies for utilities. We should have definitely stronger antitrust commissions. The other aspect that we should also look at is, are the big companies a good way to foster growth? So if I look at the 30 largest publicly traded companies in Latin America, 27% are already corporations. They used to be privately held or state-owned. 27% are now corporations. They don't have an owner. They're market-traded. They believe in separation of ownership and control. This is good for growth. State-owned companies today, of these 30 largest publicly traded Latin American companies, are only 13% of the number and 15% of the value. This is also very good. So the debate is fascinating, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Something that was mentioned is that, of course, there are benefits to having mega corporations, for example, growth. But on the other hand, of course, we want to keep sovereignty in Europe. Ms. Laluc, what's the best balance that can be found to have to benefit from innovation from mega corporations, from tech corporations, but also make sure we still have sovereignty in Europe and make sure it is being regulated for the best? Well, the best balance would be for us to become also a digital superpower. The best way to find balance, according to me, well, we have 4 critical dependencies. Having interdependency is a normal thing. When we find ourselves in a situation where we depend to the point that we lose sovereignty, to the point that our rule of law is threatened, then it becomes a problem. It was said, you've mentioned what's happened in the digital sector, but it was also the case for payment systems. Judges of the international court were sanctioned by President Trump. So now they live in the 90s, meaning they do not have access to payment systems. They do not have bank cards anymore. Even if we found a solution for these judges of the International Criminal Court, that's an issue. So when you have a foreign power that can have an impact on the rule of law, on the justice system, on the media, that's actually suicidal. That's a massive issue. So there are 4 fields in which we need to make progress. Firstly, the defense sector. The defense sector, we've talked about it for a long time. When we mentioned the Europe of the defense sector, we were told it wasn't making any progress. Well, now it's making progress. Secondly, the energy sector. We're rediscovering it at the moment with the war in the Middle East. Personally, I am ashamed. I was ashamed during the war, firstly because of course that war is horrible, but also I was ashamed because suddenly we found ourselves extremely dependent to foreign fossil fuel energies. We'd started having the Green Deal in Europe that was being damaged by the far right. When will we learn from our mistakes? So the defense sector, the energy sector, payment systems, and for that the digital euro will help us. That's a project that will help us defend ourselves from Trump's policies. And then the digital sector. And on this front, 2 things must be done. Firstly, we need to regulate. We need to regulate the outside so we can protect our companies like South Korea has done it. If South Korea has succeeded, it's because it regulated the outside players so it could protect its own companies, help them develop, and then help them plan. Planning is nothing, it's not necessarily from the Soviet Union. It's actually de Gaulle would plan a lot. So the first thing I did when I started my second mandate is that I sent a letter to the president of the commission, to several presidents, and I said, let's meet, let's actually ask digital players to come and meet with us. Let's tell them what our plan is so we can move forward in certain fields. It didn't work out because, to my great regret, the EU is too much reactive and not anticipatory enough. So I hope we're waking up. I hope we'll start developing our giants, but also our startups. We need to work. We have so much talent, Murena. I could cite so many of them. Mistral, of course, but also entrepreneurs that stayed in France, Jean-Baptiste Keynes and others. We have true gems. We have everything we need in Europe to be competitive, to face with other powers, and to be sovereign again. Thank you.
Monsieur Lévy,
Mr. Lévy, considering your experience in Russia, how do you think we could regulate and protect without becoming Sovietic, without becoming Soviet? And I'm exaggerating, of course. Well, you know, certain Europeans thought because they are not among us anymore, they thought that the EU was the new Soviet Union and that we had to get rid of it. I actually believe that we can work on this front. The idea is to find a balance between competitiveness and regulation. And I don't want to rain on your parade, but I think everyone should stay within their role. I've worked a lot on European issues when I was at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and I am struck by today's debates. Yesterday, I was listening at various debates, and European intervention is being mentioned a lot. It's being said that Europe is a power that ignores itself and it has to become strong again. I agree. However, what does Europe mean? What does the EU mean exactly? And that's where I might maybe be dampening your enthusiasm, but let's not forget these are 27 member states and oftentimes 27 diverging interests. There are industrial interests, policy interests. For a long time, France thought that Europe was just France but bigger. It's a massive mistake. We actually come up with a lot of concepts like European sovereignty or strategic autonomy, which lead to a lot of debate and sometimes frighten our partners. Let's take our approach, the European approach, and the divergences that exist. We talk of regulating the digital sector, but for a very long time, the EU actually favored an approach that favored the consumer, which is a great thing. We want to protect the consumer. We want to protect their data. We want to regulate data storing. We want to regulate platforms' behaviors, but to the detriment of the supply policy. We've been talking of a European cloud for years, and I firmly believe in the private sector's initiative in this field rather than in the state's initiative in this field.
Montrer la complexité du
Another example to show the complexity of this debate is that you have people who believe that to a certain extent we need to sacrifice certain economic interests for the sake of security. When Trump pressurizes Europeans with the support of MAGA and says, I don't want to have the same regulation framework for AI and for others, and if you don't dismantle it, then I'm going to stop providing that service. That's an example of a deal. And look at what he said today on the eve of the Ankara summit about NATO. You have some partners, including a very important neighbouring partner, very dear to us. He said, we have to be careful. The same thing when you have an offensive policy about China. A lot of countries have a lot of commercial interests with China, and that's why we refuse to activate the anti-coercion mechanism. So we can agree about having a global approach, a global action. I think a lot of what is happening today is very revelatory of what is happening, whether it's the effect of the war in Ukraine or the geopolitics of also the eruption of power-based politics. China and the United States, certainly it's true, but it's that having been said, it's very complicated, and we have to be capable of building things between us as Europeans which didn't exist previously. Bruno, from the point of view of the economy, in which area is European sovereignty the most threatened? We've talked about energy, payment systems. From my point of view, it's especially in the digital field that sovereignty is threatened. Fundamentally, we've understood that at the university. For example, I have a question at the moment. We have a lot of teachers, a lot of students, a lot of professors who are entering into contracts with big tech companies to benefit from generative AI. So each one of them is choosing one, ChatGPT, Claude as well. We have students and professors who are giving lectures and they're giving their research results, and in a way they're becoming very dependent on a technology which in fact is American. That's what's happening in concrete terms. It can be Chinese as well, but in practice it's mainly Americans. This is what we're seeing today. And so, what are we going to do when you're the head of a faculty? You're thinking, I want to help people solve the problem, so we're going to buy collective licenses to have a kind of form of equality between students, given the costs of generative AI. So we're going to buy a collective license. Okay, but which one do we buy? Gemini? ChatGPT? Which one do we buy? No. We would dream of being able to buy French, or European at least. That's what we would like to do. Of course, there is one. There's Mistral. For the time being, Mistral is not a market leader. I buy collective Mistral licenses, I'm not sure they're going to be used, in fact. So there is a huge dependency in a key sector, a huge dependency. From my point of view, this is something we have to try to modify very radically in the very near future. I'm not speaking to you as an economist, but as a faculty director. Mr. Muniz, is there an area you think where South America could give us an example in terms of regulation of digital technologies and protecting from too much dependency on the US?
I'm not an expert, but I think the example maybe is less regulation. We don't regulate much on the tech side. If we're dependent on the US, sometimes it costs less than trying not to be dependent. I've lived the 70s and the 80s where we couldn't buy a computer because we had to buy locally and nobody had money to buy a locally produced computer or microcomputer. So I think we have to have that in mind.
And Christian, le Groenland.
Christian, what about Greenland? Is at the heart of the battle. Is there something, do you think, we could learn from you?
Way to put it, and I think in the bigger scheme, I'd like to go elsewhere with your question, but if I have to do something and use something from Greenland, I think the governments, I'm not talking about more regulation, I'm talking about the speed of regulation. The governments need to invest in administrative capabilities, because that's what we're doing in the private sector. We're staffing up, we're building up. Now, most of us are working to reduce the administration in the public sector, but we, in some areas, need to be looking at staffing up and adding more capacity. Because what's happening is, and here's the Greenland example, it's not relevant, but if you take 2 dog sleds, which is a transportation in Greenland, you have one sled with 12 dogs and you have another sled with 4 dogs. Obviously, the one with the 12 dogs is going to be moving much faster. Now, that's the tech industry. They're going to come up with something new every 6 months. The one with the 4 dogs, that's the government. It's going to take 6 years to regulate something. So you need to get in line with the speed of the industries as governments. That's one thing. The other thing is you shouldn't be punishing success. We shouldn't be putting regulation in place to limit the competition. We should be protecting the competition and not the competitors per se. So we still need to have that competitive playing field is very important, I think. And then a final note, Greenland is the only country so far until Brexit that has left the EU. We did that in 1985. But to speak to something positive about the EU, the companies, the big tech companies, they're acting globally. Now, if you as governments want to stay in your national assemblies and think you can solve the problems of multinational, multi-global companies, you're in the wrong. Now, this is where the EU and other international corporations, to keep it at that, will have a very important role to play. So I foresee the EU playing a more important role, and even for Greenland that has left, there is a discussion. You see Iceland, our neighbor, considering joining the EU. I think the situation now can be used for the good of Europe, for the good of the EU, and for the good of France, obviously.
I just wanted to pinpoint, I had the privilege to meet Professor Gary Becker. I had the privilege to meet Professor Gary Becker right after the great financial crisis in 2008. And we were obviously talking about regulation and how to better regulate the financial services industry. And one thing that he told me that I never forgot is he said, well, sometimes better than no regulation is easy regulation. So people were talking about all kinds of complicated rules to control the banks. He said, just raise the capital requirement. So I think we have to remember sometimes no regulation is better. When no regulation doesn't work, simple regulation should be the second one.
Merci déjà aux 4 intervenants.
Thank you very much to our 4 speakers. And now, Bruno, we can move over to questions from the audience. If you have any questions, possibly. Now is the time. We have a gentleman here. Please introduce yourself and ask a short question, please. My name is David Levero. I have a question. You've talked about the role of politicians and politics and their capacity to regulate the power of mega companies. Don't you think that apart from the economic aspect of sovereignty and independence, don't we have here a fight between ideology and our social and societal future? Good question. Who would like to answer that one? I like that question. I'll answer also for some difficult questions. I think it's perfectly true. Let's be clear. We are in a world at war. There is war in Ukraine, there's a hybrid war in our continent, and there's a trade war. And it's an ideological war. And when we look at the narratives of tech giants, it's also an ideological war, but it's also business. That's where I'd like to say something. Here in France, we're not... There are some very good entrepreneurs who are very good at communicating. We're not used to books being a way of for a company to sell its products. We have to bear in mind that in the US, books are also written to do business. Let's not be too frightened. Some of the books written by tech giants are pretty horrible. It's part of their business model to write these books. They write these books in order to sell their products. The second point of your question, there is an ideological war and a political war. So, in fact, what we consider to be weaknesses are, in fact, our strengths. Two examples. The US is pressuring us on what? On our regulations all the time, morning, midday, and night. When I did a conference with Thierry Berton, we don't agree politically, but it's the first thing we both agree on. Whether you like regulations or you don't like them, you don't touch them. That is our strength. We must not give way on that point. We have to keep our regulations. The second point is culture and our social model. When we had the coup in Venezuela and then threats in Greenland, Greenland was the one that really woke us up. If you look at the social networks were flooded with the European way of life, not the French way of life, the European way of life. The fact that we have a greater life expectancy, we have a better education system, better gender equality, better access to healthcare. All of a sudden, we realized why we like living in Europe and why, in fact, we're not that bad. We're in pretty good shape. In fact, there is an ideological and political war which is trying to get us to give way before we've even started fighting. People saying, you'll never be able to get big tech. You look, we're too strong for you. That's what we're being told. That's not true. The European Union isn't finished. It's not finalized. We don't have a budget. Lots of things are missing, but we are fighting with Russia, China, and Trump's US, and we are still standing. That means we're much stronger than we think. Although nothing's perfect, we're not perfect, as we've explained today. And that is why we are a target for these people, because we are standing up and we must continue to stand up. Christian, and then other speaker.
Question, because I think you are absolutely right that the short answer is we. Yes, this is happening. The ideologies that we know of are under challenge. Now, France and the French institutions are very good in researching this. But this needs to happen. We need to be renegotiating the ideas of capitalism. We need to come to terms with what happened with socialism. I come from Greenland, a country that is still strong in ideology, but as a result, we seem to be missing out on some of the investments and some of the activities. So unless you have an economy like ours, we're fairly wealthy, I don't think you have the luxury of sticking to ideology over what's happening. Even ideology has to move on in this world. I think that's a very, very important point to be making when we're talking the new economy and what the tech giants are bringing to this.
Une deuxième question de la salle, s'il vous plaît.
Another question from the audience? Thank you. I'll be a bit provocative. I've just read the book by Ron Konovich, a Nobel Prize winner, who I've heard people saying it was a fantastic book, and there are lots of great ideas in this book. There's one chapter I liked very much, where he describes China as being contradictory communist country. The parallel I draw with this is the Communist Party looks after order and politics and business, and there's a free market, and looks what happens to Baidu when they didn't exist 30 years ago. Do you see a parallel between the Silicon Valley, which seems to be against democracy and considers democracy to be something that is outdated, and that they say that we're going to provide prosperity and wealth? I'm going a bit further, I'm exaggerating. And then Europe is an island where we are moving towards state capitalism. If you look at Russia, China and the US and other countries, we don't know where Brazil is going. We are an island where we have prosperity, equality and fraternity and freedom. Everything is fine, and we are not participating in this race. I'm not saying that we can have a state capitalism like the Chinese or the Americans, but our so-called social democratic model, isn't it a bit obsolete? I'm exaggerating a little bit. What I'd like to say, do you think I'm right, or do you think we need to change? I think we have to be, we shouldn't stand back from taking difficult decisions. Thank you for that provocative question. I understand the question very well. I think all of us have fully understood what is at stake behind this question. I wanted to come back to this idea that the European countries and the social protection we have puts us in the red in this race. It's not true on paper, in fact. Social protection is a very well-developed insurance system. We should be capable of dealing with these risks. Our social protection systems are designed so that our citizens can be compensated when there's a big shock, such as technological shocks or other. There are individual shocks, there are health shocks, retirement being longer than expected. The systems are designed for that. But the fact that we're living in countries that are protective isn't necessarily something that spontaneously is not compatible with risk-taking, even on a large scale. The question then becomes not abandoning social protection towards moving towards a system which is completely oriented towards technological choices that are very, very strong. That's not the question. The question is, how do we reform our social protection system so that it provides better support for people to take risks while still protecting the vulnerabilities of European citizens? It is perfectly possible. I'm certain of that. We can reform that social protection for it to be more based on insurance and helps people to take risks. I would like to add something. I can't remain inert faced with this provocation. I absolutely agree with your analysis. Social protection also has to be designed as something that encourages competitiveness. The heart of the European approach is it's a market-based approach, and this is what differentiates it from what is happening in China and in the US, and of course in Russia. Secondly, the analyses that you talk about in your book, in this book, talking about China, are completely detached from reality. In China, you don't have the Communist Party on one side and the enterprises on the other side. It's a single bloc. And when you see a company that doesn't keep to the rules, such as Jack Ma, as we've saw nearly, they are punished. And the same thing in the US. There are libertarians in the US, and they've changed their political side, because California previously was seen as the avant-garde of freedom and democracy. Now look at what is happening. There's been a complete ideological turnaround. Now we can see this European singularity in terms of the economy with the social market economy, and the message of liberation and freedom that we convey, and also the idea of a collective approach in the world. This is a problem for many people. That's why we're a target for Moscow, Washington, and Peking. Can I tell you a little story? As a president of a commission, I have to go to Washington every year, and I went just before Trump was elected. And I talked to a lot of big business leaders who wanted to tell me, yes, you Europeans, you're lagging behind. I said to them, that's all very well. You're going to have somebody who's going to apply tariffs to your companies. So be quiet, I said to them. They all said to me, no, but Donald Trump, he says lots of things.
OK. Un an après, j'y suis retournée.
A year later, I talked to them again, and they're all frightened. They were all frightened because, in fact, the line, we're never going to negotiate about our values and our democracies. We should never negotiate about the rule of law. There is something called ownership rights. All of a sudden, because they could see that Donald Trump was stopping various activities, and so they said, that might happen to us next. And we have to bear that in mind. Thank you for your provocation. You never negotiate on your principles and values on the rule of law. That always ends badly if you start giving away on those points. I have one more short question, please. Yes, hello. I'd like to react to what you said, madam. The big European French companies need to have sustainability, stability, and growth, and credibility. Isn't there a distortion, which means that at a particular time your voice cannot be heard because the regulations are very difficult? This is what you said earlier. And these distortions, are these distortions caused because a company that is respectable, it needs to have a long-term future, it needs to have growth in a political world that is very short-lived? So you say something that exists at one time then no longer exists. You talked about Trump and his predecessor. It's always the same thing. Isn't this difference between the two that causes a problem? Because political politicians don't last for very long, whereas businesses work on a much longer term. So the difference between timescale between the world of politics and the world of business. So does that mean we shouldn't have elections? So if we draw conclusions from what you've said, that means that we shouldn't have elections anymore. Well, earlier you were saying that there are difficulties getting common regulations which would make it possible to make progress and which would give you security. However, these regulations are developed by politicians, and they are not in office for very long. Today they summoned at the European Commission. Tomorrow they won't be there anymore. Isn't this a problem of instability of the relations? Louis XXI, that could be Louis the 21st. Yeah, why not have a King of France? The return of monarchy to prevent the instability of politicians. Well, I can understand you're being provocative on purpose. Your provocation is that French companies need stability, and occasionally our laws and our regulations don't always guarantee that stability. I'm a specialist in labor law. The labor market is constantly changing. It doesn't help people who are looking for jobs. It doesn't help companies make the right decisions. They always get the impression they're on a very unstable regulatory framework, and that doesn't facilitate economic activity. That having been said, if we say, okay, well, let's get rid of democracy, that's going a bit far, I think. We need to have planning and a long-term approach. We have something to reduce uncertainty. This was the famous French plan. This is what made it possible to rebuild France after the war. I can see I talk to digital entrepreneurs. They don't say the problem is the regulation. What they need is to have a full order book. So our administration today has to order European digital. That's what we should do to fill the order books. Thank you very much, Madame Laluc. Thank you very much, Bruno Cruz, Christian Kelts from Greenland, Mr. Levy, and Mr. Minis for this discussion. And I wish you an excellent day.